Welcome to Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point. I'm Li Qiuwen, sitting in for Liu Xin. In this series, I dissect stories that are making headlines around the world and talk to my guests to make up for the missing pieces of the puzzle. So join us in real time by sending us your comments or questions via the CGTN page on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Weibo, or WeChat. We live stream Headline Buster at 11 a.m. Beijing time on Thursdays and air the segment on TV at 11:30 a.m. on Fridays. Do join us during the live streaming and get in touch. We would love to receive and possibly read out your insightful comments. Well, in this week, we'll look into China's economy, a topic that has made international headlines after the National Bureau of Statistics released its quarterly data on July 17th. China's GDP grew by 5.5% year-on-year in the first half of 2023. So despite the complex international environment and domestic challenges, that is in line with the full-year target of around 5% for 2023. From April to June, China's GDP growth stood at 6.3% year-on-year, the highest since 2022, as you can see from this chart. Now, let's break it down. In the first half of the year, total retail sales of consumer goods maintained a relatively fast growth of 8.2% year-on-year in January to June. Consumption contributed 77.2% to the economic growth, and China's total goods imports and exports expanded 2.1% year-on-year to 20.1 trillion yuan. That's about $2.81 trillion US dollars. Exports grew 3.7% year-on-year, while imports edged down 0.1% from a year earlier. Note that China has overtaken Japan, becoming #1 car exporter in the first quarter, with 1.07 million of car sales. Let's listen to what the spokesperson of the National Bureau of Statistics sum up these data.
Globally, economic recovery has been sluggish since the beginning of the year, with persistent inflationary pressures. Major economies have implemented monetary tightening measures to tackle inflation, which has led to noticeable spillover effects. However, in the face of these complex external challenges, China's economy has managed to outperform major developed economies, showcasing its robust resilience in economic development.
So how does China's GDP growth compare with other major economies? Still relatively high, said the spokesperson of the National Bureau of Statistics, with the United States at 1.8%, the Eurozone at 1%, Japan at 1.9%, and Brazil at 4% in the first quarter of 2023. What's more, China's growth rate in the first half of 2023 is projected to be among the highest. In January 2023, the World Bank forecast for China was 4.3%, but it raised to 5.6% in its forecast in June. However, it has revised down projections for most economies as a bumpy road still lies ahead. Now, in the latest update to its World Economic Outlook on July 25th, the IMF set its forecast for growth in China unchanged at 5.2% in 2023. Nevertheless, concerns over China's economy looms large as data in the first half of 2023 are partly driven by a low base from the same period last year. So, is China in trouble? Well, that's what The Economist wants its readers to believe. For the private sector, for example, of course, the Chinese government has already acknowledged the situation. On July 19th, China's State Council announced a raft of 31 measures to spur private sector growth, including removing barriers to market access and ensuring fair competition. And there's also youth unemployment. In June, the surveyed unemployment rate for young people aged 16 to 24 reached 21.3%, the highest since the data was first collected in the year 2018. However, it is projected to edge up in the coming months as more young people will be entering the job market. And to make it easier to find jobs, employers across the country will be encouraged to provide 1 million internships. A strong focus on vocational training will allow at least 15 million people to hone their job skills this year. What else needs to be done? Well, on July 24th, the Political Bureau of the Communist Party of China Central Committee held a meeting on economic work and set the tone for the second half of the year. The meeting pointed at an insufficient domestic demand, a sluggish private sector growth, some risks and hidden dangers in key areas, as well as a grim and complex external environment. The government will stick to a proactive fiscal policy and a prudent monetary policy. Strong support will be given to scientific and technological innovation, the real economy, and the development of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. However, what does China's economy look like through the lens of Western media? Is China struggling, or other media struggling to push their narrative? Let's now take a closer look. As expected, the media has been keen on jumping on the bandwagon, with Bloomberg sort of berating China for its disappointing growth. And for CNBC, China's economy seems to be grinding to a halt with signs of stalled recovery. The Economist puts on its white coat and takes the pulse of China's economy. I'm not in the least surprised. After all, we've all been hearing about the coming collapse of China for decades, to quote the title of a book published in 2001. Well, the Western media revels in doom-mongering, and every bit of data can be used to substantiate claims of a coming collapse. Well, I've got news for you. Collapse? It isn't. China's economy is resilient, and before passing judgment on China based on a selective set of data, I would like to advise looking at the bigger picture here. If China's data were reportedly disappointing, it's because that the world is still looking to China for growth. And that's fantastic news. Despite all the talk of decoupling and de-risking, most economies are still heavily betting on China. Well, bad news for China seems bad news for the world economy. So let's get real there for a minute. We've also seen reports on China's deflationary trends. And for those old enough to remember, that's what happened during Japan's lost decade in the 1990s. Will China suffer Japan's fate? Well, most Western media are sounding the alarm bell, blaming sluggish demand. China is on the brink of deflation, and deflation is looming. The data says that in the first half of the year, China's consumer price index rose 0.7% year on year, and the producer price index dropped 3.1% during the first 6 months. In June, the CPI continued to edge lower, staying flat on a yearly basis, while the PPI fell further to a record low since 2016. But is it a structural problem? Not really, according to Liu Guoqiang, deputy governor of the People's Bank of China. He said that the challenges currently faced by the Chinese economy are a normal phenomenon in the era following the global COVID-19 pandemic. In response to the country's softening price growth in recent months, Liu predicted that China's consumer price index, or CPI, the main gauge of inflation, will see a U-shaped trajectory this year. And even CNBC is at odds with the deflation narrative, calling it disinflation. However, Macquarie economists Larry Hu and Yu Xiaozhang characterized the condition in China as disinflation, a temporary slowdown of rising prices, rather than deflation, which refers to a more serious problem where there's a persistent decrease in prices over time. So it's more a readjustment than a structural problem. No lost decade on the horizon, obviously. Plus, China has plenty of leeway to use highly targeted monetary tools. It did so in the past, and it will continue now, as it has many fiscal and monetary policy options available. So now let's dig into what's obsessing many commentators: China's youth unemployment. The surveyed unemployment rate for young people aged 16 to 24 hit a record 21.3% in June. Al Jazeera points at China's seemingly poor economic performance and its failure to provide enough jobs. While Business Insider quotes Northwestern University economist Nancy Chan, saying that China's economy is in crisis and the nation's young unemployment problem could be at the root of its current troubles. Well, if the economy is going to grow or at least avoid a contraction in the long run, the government must create the conditions for job creation in high productivity sectors and for greater investment in higher education. Well, this is more of a global problem than just a China problem. As China moves up the value chain and with the ongoing technological innovation and the emergence of new industries, especially in the service sector, the China labor market is consistently evolving, creating new opportunities for job seekers and businesses. Flexibility and adaptability are crucial to fixing youth unemployment. No one said it would be all roses and that China has a magic wand to solve all the problems, especially given the sheer size of China's job markets. And commentators have been keen on reading the tea leaves on China's economy, but its futile exercise in taxiography has its limits. Yes, China is facing numerous challenges, and we cannot expect miracles overnight.
Making sense of the overwhelming wave of information means cutting through the noise to shine a light on the heart of the story and making room for new perspectives. True understanding means the ability to see events from more than one side. I'm Liu Xin, and this is The Point.
Welcome back to Headline Buster. Today we want to take a closer look at China's newly released economic data in the second quarter. Is it all doom or gloom, or is China on the brink of deflation? Well, to talk more about these, I'm joined by Mr. Weiwen, Senior Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, joining me in Shanghai. Great to see you, Mr. He. And Mr. William Li, Chief Economist at Milken Institute, joining me from Henderson, Nevada. Thank you for joining us. And Mr. Sourabh Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies, joining me from Washington, D.C. Great to see you. Thank you for joining us, gentlemen. So, Mr. Li, why don't I start with you? China's newly released data in the second quarter has not been interpreted in the most positive way. A lot of reports in the West have been focusing on this, saying that China's recovery is losing steam with faltering business confidence. Let me get your read on this. What do you think after seeing the data?
I think that characterization is coming about because the pattern that we've seen in the West of a post-COVID recovery is a very rapid spurt of growth that is almost in the double digits, and then it starts to eventually taper off. And we expected that from China as well when it released the COVID-19 restrictions. When we saw the first quarter was really quite strong, but unfortunately the second quarter didn't continue that momentum. People started asking the question, whether there are any fundamental vulnerabilities that are holding back China from experiencing the typical pattern of recovery. So I think that's the source of concern. It's sort of a query as to why is China different from every other recovery we've seen in the world? Not so much a blame of China, but rather a question that says, are there other things going on?
So different patterns are being observed when it comes to recovery in China and other parts of the world. But Mr. Gupta, do you think that these analyses have been making fair assessments?
Not particularly fair assessments. They've been looking at it's a glass half full, glass half empty situation, and they've been making the pessimistic assumption. Yes, there are certain headwinds that China is facing, cyclical headwinds and larger, broader structural reforms that are necessary. I think China has enormous potential for growth, frankly. Seen in the light of its larger modernization program, I think we're just about two-thirds the distance towards China's modernization. There's still, I'd say, about 3 decades more to go. Require important structural reforms. We can discuss those later. But at this point of time, yes, there are headwinds to growth in the short term. But I think the government is making the right decision in not throwing money at the problem and having a stimulus, as much as working through those issues which are there in the economy and trying to, again, animate the animal instincts of the private sector so that they can get back to investing, because at the end of the day, they create 80% of jobs in urban areas, and you really need to have the private sector come out of the shadows and start putting a footprint down and its mark in the Chinese economy.
Mr. He, let me get your take on what's been said, especially the parts by Mr. Li talking about where do these concerns from Western countries come from. Instead of blaming China, they're trying to figure out what's really happening here. What do you think, Mr. He?
I think my focus is not the figure for the first half, but for the second quarter. For the second quarter, China GDP grew by 6.3% year on year, but last year's the second quarter was extremely low base, 0.4% growth. So make the 2-year average of only 3.3%. That's exceptionally low. We should certainly improve that. We should also find the reasons because of the inadequate demand, either in industry or the consumer market, and especially we should not neglect the export sector. Net export contributed a negative 0.6 percentage points to China's GDP for the first half. But first half of last year, it contributed positively 0.5 percentage points. So we see problems in different sides, and now the central government has have adopted a number of measures, and also they recently set out the 21-point measures supporting the private economy. I'm sure that we will see the economic pickup in the second half of this year.
But Mr. Lee, talk to us about your thoughts on the China collapse theory. I mean, are you surprised to see that after seeing China has become the world's second biggest economy, after seeing how resilient the economy could become, that this theory is still around? Is there any merit to it?
Well, I think it goes too far to say that there's a cheering group out there that's cheering for China's collapse. In fact, I think most people are cheering for China's success because many of the economies of the world are tied to the success of China, especially in Asia and including the United States. After all, China is a vital part of the global supply chain of which the United States has benefited. So I think the real questions, I think, have to settle on what my colleagues have just said. Do we have sufficient domestic demand within China to have it a self-sufficient growing engine for the rest of the world? Will China be able to be the second largest economy that provides an engine for growth for the rest of the world as the rest of the world is slowing down because it's fighting inflation? And China, fortunately, has got the right balance of supply and demand so that it itself domestically has not experienced the kind of inflation we've seen in other parts of the world, including Europe and the United States. So I think those are the kind of perspectives that we have to have here. And many of the American companies that are in China, from JP Morgan to Tesla to Bill Gates coming to China, they all say the world is committed to staying in China. And the world is committed to China's success because the world's success depends on China's success. So I think those are the kind of perspectives that are really dominant in the West. The questions that are being asked would be, is China continuing to be a good place for more investment? Should we be putting more money into China? Or is China's own policy of diversifying its production, going upscale to higher value-added production, and moving a lot of industries out of China, the low value-added stuff, to other parts of Asia? Should we be following those dollars? And so the questions are really much more a tactical question about where best Western dollars should be going. And we're looking for the government for guidance as to where it is that China really wants to make use of foreign capital inflows, which it has clearly invited in the last several statements that the President Xi and others have made. So I think those are the kind of perspectives that we have to keep in mind. And there really isn't an army out there cheering for China's demise. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Everyone is cheering for China's success.
Those are legitimate concerns, I must say. These questions on investors from the West are also on the mind of Chinese business people, entrepreneurs here. And there is the talk of deflation, right? When the West is battling inflation, some say that the real risk for China is deflation. Mr. Gupta, let me get your thoughts on this. How real is the threat? Does what's happening here really qualify for a deflation?
No, and as you mentioned earlier, it's more of China is facing disinflation rather than deflation. China went through deflation during the early part of the 2010s, and that hurt its capacity to grow. And that's why the fear is that it might slip from deflation to disinflation to deflation. I don't think that's about to happen, and that's going to happen. I think there's a huge amount of growth that's still in the economy which can be had. But let me get to the bottom of why we talk about this disinflation, deflation business. And part of it is that, in China, there is excess fixed asset investment, particularly in the property sector. And there's perhaps overinvestment in the property sector. The government recognizes there's overinvestment, and that's why it doesn't want to juice the property sector. Of course, it doesn't want to collapse in that sector because the sector is so important. But because that sector is so large, but is not getting enough support, rightly so, it is also hurting larger growth prospects. And therefore, the focus here should be how does one pivot away from that fixed asset investment growth model to a model which is more consumption-based, advanced manufacturing-based. And frankly, China is making that transition, and that transition needs to happen faster so that people are not so fixated in terms of the asset values of their property, but more in terms of the asset values of their financial investments in the financial market, and therefore will feel freer to consume. Of course, there's structural reforms like hukou reform, which can be done, as well as helping resource local governments, because private entrepreneurs and private capital, it's a very delicate dance in China between private entrepreneurs and with local governments. The federal government, the central government is at a level above. And that's the area where there is still the necessity for support, but local government finances need to be cleaned out. So, I mean, it's these sort of issues which are there and have been there for a while, but all of them are amenable to a resolution. And that's why I think China is on the cusp of transitioning to a different growth model, which will see it realize 5% growth for a long period of time. And we're not talking, I mean, this is like the IMF talk in terms of, for 5 years. I'm thinking in terms of 15, 20 years, China can maintain a decent growth capacity, but it needs to make that transition in terms of its economic growth model.
Yeah, there's a host of factors at play here when it comes to China's economic performance. Mr. He, on top of sluggish domestic demand, what about external factors? What about all these talks about decoupling, de-risking from European countries, from the United States? How are they impacting China's recovery?
We have seen some vestiges of decoupling. For instance, for the first half or first 5 months of this year, China's export to the United States, according to the U.S. official data, fell by 27% year on year. But the U.S. imports from the European Union and from Mexico grew rapidly. So that's a part of the vestige of decoupling, but that's not the real decoupling. Far away from decoupling. Decoupling is not possible. But anyway, it affects China's export performances and as a whole passed on to the performance of the whole economy. So we should continue to open our door widely to welcome investors from the world, including from the United States, to do business in China and to make sure to the world that China's economy is stable and has a vast prospects in a long time, and so as to attract the world investors and so as to prove to the world that decoupling is not possible.
I want to take some time to look at youth unemployment. We're all very concerned about it. China has seen its highest unemployment rate in this age group since the record began. Mr. Gupta, what's the biggest problem here? What seems to be not working?
It's part of that transition to a different growth model. China is moving out there. Over the last few years, there have been certain crackdowns that China did to get its marketplace in order in the digital sector particularly. But much of that crackdown has now come to an end, and I think there is more regulatory certainty. Now, places like the platform economy, the digital economy are huge employers. And therefore, as private capital comes out of the sidelines and starts investing again, I think that is where youth employment issues will be tackled. Because as I said, the private sector creates almost 80% of jobs in the Chinese economy, and they are on the sidelines at this moment. But I think that process is easing. But we'll have to see in this regard. And it's important because you do want people to have money in their pocket to set up their lives, because that's how you can have consumption over the life horizon, and that's how the economy will also do well. If I may just jump back once on one point in terms of the decoupling issue, sure. You were talking externally. Yes, decoupling is a real problem, but I think it's more from a structural and more medium-term perspective. I think the immediate problem at this time is in the US economy, in the Western economies, the advanced economies, interest rates are still too high because inflation is still too high, and that is causing economic growth to suffer, and therefore they are having problem with consumption, basically consumption of exports from China and from other parts of the world. And that's why China's export performance is not good, but that has primarily to do with the lack of demand in Western economies, and I think that will change, not in a year, but perhaps in over the longer spell. But so the external sector is dodgy right now, and I'm not pinning my hopes on that. But China must continue to stay the world champion of intermediate goods production and exports, and I think that's a good strategy.
And Mr. Lee, I do want to get your take on youth unemployment problem. I mean, this is a global issue rather than just a China problem. We've seen this problem in a lot of European countries, in Spain, in Italy, and in the United States as well. How are you looking at China's efforts in tackling this issue, providing about 1 million internships or focusing on vocational training for 15 million people. Is that enough? Will it work?
Actually, you're absolutely right to point to that figure, the fact that youth unemployment is a problem all over the world. Integrating new workers into the workforce is something that every country is facing. United States, Europe. Europe has got double-digit youth unemployment numbers for the longest time, and it's lived with that. But I think the reason why I, among other Western commentators that have pointed to China and China's problem, is because youth unemployment is generally addressed, as Mr. Gupta said, when private sector creates a lot of jobs and innovative jobs and high value-added jobs and high production jobs. And usually the source of those jobs are going to come from the high-tech industries, the Alibabas and Tencents of the world, the innovators that make use of the very well-trained people coming out of Beijing University and the great engineering schools that China has. But when we saw over the last 2 years a shift in the policies of China toward Tencent, Alibaba, and some of these larger technological companies, the Western investors became concerned, and we pointed to the unemployment numbers of the youth to say, hey, that policy switch has got huge consequences for the absorption of the next generation of workers and the source of productivity for China. So what is going on there? And now that we seem to get some clarification that China has in fact not really changed its attitude toward technology, that it's welcoming innovation, in fact it's trying to spur innovation, there may be some easing of concerns, but I think the fact that that reversal took place and now an explanation and the rise in youth unemployment puts together a lot of circumstantial evidence that says, well, China may have some deeper structural vulnerabilities that the policymakers have to address. And so youth unemployment is really at the spearhead of things that Western investors look at to see the health of China. When that number starts to go down and go down in a convincing, permanent, sustainable fashion, then more people will be convinced that China is going to be back on the right path to the kind of growth rates it had before. But if it's not able to get that youth unemployment down, then I think this can have even more consequences for the other policies of China, which is boosting domestic consumption. Households have, well, there are two things that economists know drive consumption. One is wealth, and the other one is income. Family income is a hugely important thing. And when my children are not getting jobs, I'm not going to be consuming, right? I'm going to be trying to help my children. And when the property market is in disarray and my wealth is uncertain, I'm not going to consume. So these are two sources of vulnerability that we have in the Chinese economy that we in the West are looking at and saying, what are they doing about it? And so I think that's really the questions that are being asked, and we're hoping to get some clear answers.
And youth population, they're actually a very important driver for overall consumption. This age group tend to spend more in education, in culture, in communication, etc. You know, restoring their consumption power, increasing their employment might be very important for restoring recovery post-pandemic. Thank you very much. I guess that's all the time we have for this edition of Headline Buster. We appreciate all your perspectives, Mr. Gupta, Mr. He, and Mr. Lee. Great to have all of you with us. And thank you for watching. Bye for now.